Once a wealthy nation, Venezuela is in financial crisis. Its currency is crumbling. Inflation could reach 1,000,000%. The president introduces a radical recovery plan. But can it fix the economy? And what will the political fallout be? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America, but now it's facing one of the most critical economic crises in the world. Inflation has skyrocketed, prices are at an all-time high, and the national currency, the bolivar, has lost much of its value. Some Venezuelans could now struggle to buy a cup of coffee. The cost? About 2 million bolivars. The financial devastation has led to mass migration, starvation, and political unrest. President Nicolas Maduro blames it on what he calls an economic war against his country. His critics say widespread corruption and the government's mismanagement are responsible. In an attempt to solve the problem, the government has introduced a plan to curb hyperinflation. There's a new currency, the sovereign bolivar, which will remove 5 zeros from banknotes. It's backed by a cryptocurrency, the Petro, that's pegged to the price of oil. The government is also raising the minimum wage by 3,000%, raising taxes and increasing petrol prices for some drivers. How are Venezuelans reacting to the new measures? Here's our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, in Caracas.
Confusion, concern, and especially uncertainty are the only way to describe how most Venezuelans are receiving their new currency. These are 10 new bolivares. Until Friday, they were worth 1 million of the old bolivares. They're the maximum amount that you can take out of a cash machine at one time. But they are not worth more. They just have 5 less zeros than the old bills. Faced with the world's highest hyperinflation, the government has not just shaven zeros off the bills, but is raising corporate and sales taxes and increasing the minimum wage several thousand%. Venezuela's largest private business association says that this is not the way to save the economy.
Although it's necessary to raise salaries, raising the minimum wage by 3,500% makes it impossible for businesses to meet these new increases in an economy that is underwater because of a severe depression. If hyperinflation is not controlled, the impact of this increase will be totally counterproductive.
President Nicolas Maduro says he'll subsidize small and medium-sized companies for 90 days. Here in Caracas, almost everything was closed on the first day of the new currency's debut. The government had declared Monday a public holiday. Nothing is open, complained this man, not even the mini supermarkets. We're waiting to see what happens. Indeed, people are confused, and with very good reason. They don't know how to calculate what they're spending, especially since the new salaries don't go into effect until next month.
So how did the crisis develop? Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, which account for 90% of its total exports. So when oil prices collapsed, Caracas suffered a cash shortage. The government, suddenly faced with a gaping hole in its finances, had to cut back on some of its most popular social programs. It tightened control over access to U.S. dollars, leading to a flourishing black market and unprecedented inflation. Instead of cutting spending, the government printed more money, driving inflation up further. Its annual rate is now the world's highest, and the International Monetary Fund says it could reach up to 1,000,000% this year. Venezuela has also been hit by international sanctions, with the United States prohibiting dealings in new debt. All right, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Merida, Venezuela, Paul Dobson. He's a journalist for Venezuela Analysis, an independent news site based in Venezuela. From Washington, D.C. is Sonia Schott, a Latin America analyst with a focus on Venezuela. And from Atlanta by Skype is Charles Shapiro, former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela. Thank you all for joining us. Sonia, I want to start with you. Will this new currency help at all?
Of course not. Okay, this is not the first time that we have seen a government in Latin America to remove zeros from the currency. That had happened in Argentina, in Brazil, in Colombia, but the situation was quite different. Even that happened before in Latin America in the 70s, 80s.
Yeah, Sonia, sorry to interrupt. Hugo Chavez also knocked zeros off of the Bolivar in 2008, correct?
Yeah, that's true. So, okay, it's not against that, but to that time, Venezuela was a very different country. During the Chavez time, Venezuela was still wealthy. Actually, the wealthy is Venezuela. The problem is the mismanagement of the economy because the resources are there. Venezuelans, they still have oil, they still have raw materials. The problem is the mismanagement of the government. And that's why this is not going, it's too little and too late what the Maduro government is doing right now. It's not going to help, and I think this is going to worsen the situation.
Charles, I saw you nodding along to what Sonia was saying. I mean, President Maduro is saying that this is a revolutionary formula. Can you expand on what Sonia was saying, and what do you think about all of it?
It's not a revolutionary formula, it's an insane formula. I congratulate Lucia Newman for being able to describe it with a straight face. They've developed a Rube Goldberg machine and said that today is Monday when in fact it's Tuesday. It's simply, currency has value because people have faith in the currency, and they've done nothing to restore the faith in what the government's doing, in government policy, or in the Bolivar, no matter how many zeros it has on it.
Well, Charles, let me follow up on what you were saying. I mean, this cryptocurrency that they're talking about, I mean, this would require online tools and infrastructure even to make daily purchases. I mean, how would the average Venezuelan even begin to utilize something like this?
You just answered your own question. They can't. Inflation will continue apace. It's bad government policy, dropping oil production. Oil production in Venezuela is at the level it was at in 1947. And I will disagree with one thing. They had gaping holes in their budget when Hugo Chavez was president. What's happened is the gaping holes are even greater and the printing presses are running full time.
Paul, how are Venezuelans viewing all this, viewing this new currency, and viewing all that's going on?
Well, the vast majority of Venezuelans put their faith in the government once again in May 20th, in the last elections, on a very clear ticket. And this ticket was, we'll put our faith in you, but we need stronger measures in the economic area, and we need something to be done. Now, 3 months later, we are seeing certainly audacious measures from the government in the economic area, and Venezuelans are, to that extent, they're quite happy to see something being done, something drastic, something different, something creative in the economy. Whether or not it'll be successful or not, it's far too early to say, of course. But the general opinion on the street is that these are well received, these measures, because they're seeing that something is being done. They're trying something new, and that's obviously much better than doing nothing in the deteriorating economic situation.
Sonia, beyond this, what other steps is President Maduro, planning on taking, and what kind of pressure is he under domestically right now?
Well, actually, we are seeing that how Venezuela is collapsing before our eyes. So the crisis in Venezuela, not just only the political crisis, but also the economical crisis, it's not to avoid. It is impossible not to see what's going on in the country, even for the president of Venezuela. And I would like to say something that is key, a key element for the economy, and this is trust. And my question will be, is anyone in Venezuela trusting Maduro to lead the policies, the economic policies to save the country from a collapse? Even the international community, is there a trust in Venezuela? That will be the answer. And if you can answer the question, then you will see what's going on. So the future, it doesn't look very rosy right now.
Charles, let's talk for a moment about
no trust at all.
Charles, let's talk for a moment about the U.S.'s relationship with Venezuela. I mean, there are the sanctions. There are looming sanctions. I mean, has the U.S. State Department been doing enough from your point of view?
Oh, gosh. I think U.S. State Department is looking to see what they can do to affect change in Venezuela. But at the end of the day, we don't have the leverage on Maduro to get him to change. I mean, there will be more sanctions, I can guarantee you that. There will be more indictments against Venezuelan government officials. as the evidence is developed and presented in court, there are sanctions against the Petro. But the real answer is the amount of money that Goldman Sachs has lost investing in Venezuela. People don't want to invest in Venezuela. Venezuelans don't want to invest in Venezuela. Venezuelans are taking their money out of the country if they have any. And in fact, 2 million Venezuelans have fled the country. Neighboring countries and countries as far away as Peru and Ecuador are jammed with Venezuelans who are fleeing their country because there's lack of food, lack of medicine, no work, and currency they have no faith in.
Paul, I just want to take a step back for a moment to sort of remind our viewers how Venezuela got to the point that it's at. I mean, Venezuela boasts enormous oil riches and crude production, but it's been in steady decline economically over the past decade. How did it get to this point?
Complicated question, a complicated answer. No, obviously, in the time that we have available, we can't go fully into the causes of the economic collapse at the moment. But I think the
in as brief a way as you can, if you could.
Of course, the main point here is that when oil was discovered in Venezuela, the whole economy started to shift. National production in industry and agriculture and a whole range of other fields got abandoned in preference for oil. And this is still going on to some extent. Now, obviously, in the last few years, oil prices have been extremely high. There was a serious lacking of the government in terms of industrialization of the country at this point when they had the resources to do this. And currently, still, Venezuela is over-dependent on oil and a few other natural resources which they take out of the ground. They haven't been able to diversify their economy and become self-sufficient in especially agriculture, but also in industry and other areas. So they're still very independent on imports. Now, if you're dependent on imports, you're dependent on currency exchanges. And if you're dependent on currency exchanges, then to some extent, you're dependent on a foreign currency. Now, obviously, this is where sanctions have really hit home. Sanctions have had a massive impact here in Venezuela. US-led sanctions from the US State Department, which have been replicated by Canada and Panama and Switzerland and the EU. These sanctions have made it almost impossible for Venezuela to import a range of goods, including medicines and important subsidies for the food sector, because they're not allowing access to the financial institutions. They're not Venezuelan private firms, Venezuelan government, Venezuelan public firms, anyone is not able to pay for the import of goods. They can import them, but they can't pay for them. So obviously, no one will send them any goods because they're not allowed access to the financial infrastructure, which is, of course, dominated by Washington. This is a brief summary of some of the problems we have. There's obviously a lot more involved here.
Sure.
The issue of corruption has something to do with it, and mismanagement, and a whole series of other issues. No, but this is a summary I will give you.
Charles, it looked to me as though you might have been shaking your head a little bit during the answer there. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, they were running a deficit when oil was at 120. Oil dropped all the way down to below 40. Right now, it's in around 60. They're continuing to run a deficit. The problem, the core problem is bad economic policy. And to straighten things out, the government of I would say the illegitimate government of Nicolas Maduro would have to, frankly, reverse everything that they are doing. They didn't put money aside in a rainy day fund when prices were high, and they are reaping the results of that policy now.
Sonia, the opposition is calling for nationwide protests. Look, would that be effective? And what more could the opposition do?
Well, actually, we have seen that the opposition indeed has called for a protest today, but also the government. So you see, it's a way of intimidating the opposition. So the government called for a protest and the opposition too at the same time. So it is that will be the best example to see how the political situation has been in Venezuela and why the opposition the government has left less room for the opposition in order to exercise their liberties or their rights too. So it is actually very few that the opposition can do. I think it is more on the international community, put more pressure on Venezuela in order to try to reach something, because The only way out right now for Venezuela is that the Maduro regime step aside, call for free and transparent elections in Venezuela, and give the opportunity to all Venezuelans to live in peace and prosperity and in democracy.
Paul, you heard Sonia talk about, the fact that the international community, as she said, should be putting more pressure on Venezuela. But let me ask you this. Are there countries right now that are friendly towards Venezuela? Are there countries that Venezuela can depend on for help?
Of course, of course. It's very important for your viewers, I think, to try to break this, let's say, Western-centric opinion that the world is dominated by Europe and the United States. Venezuela has many allies in the Middle East, in the Far East. We're talking about China, India here, Russia, Iran, also here in Latin America. There's numerous allies in the Caribbean, Central America, and in South America. Now, these are allies who, especially, for example, in the case of India, which is an interesting case in point, which has a massive growing economy, a very digital economy, and very vibrant cyber crypto economy sector. They provide a lot of support for Venezuela in these economic changes. Also, the Chinese economy, with their technical know-how, and a very recent significant loan to the oil sector in Venezuela to help modernize its infrastructure. So Venezuela definitely has numerous allies across the world. Obviously, the US government has successfully brought about certain regime changes in Latin America in the last few years, in Brazil by installing a dictator, in Argentina by the election of a right-wing government, and obviously with the election of the ultra-rightist in Colombia on Venezuela's border. But that's not to say that Venezuela is without allies in the region or within the world.
Charles, how do you see all this playing out regionally, at least in the short term?
Well, I must be living in a different world than Paul is, because Venezuela's allies are few and far between. Russia, Syria, China, Cuba, Nicaragua. Over the short term, I see more chaos in Venezuela. The government policies, unfortunately, just flat out are not going to work, and that's going to create more crisis in Venezuela, more refugees leaving the country, which then is going to translate into crisis in all the neighboring countries, in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, increasing numbers of Venezuelans going both to Europe and to North America.
Charles, let me just follow up on what you were saying. I mean, when it comes to the migrants, I mean, there's so many people that are leaving Venezuela, and now this is causing some tension with neighboring countries as well. I mean, do you believe that there will be anti-immigration sentiment, that will be growing?
It's already happened in Brazil and in Peru and Ecuador, excuse me. So yeah, I mean, to have these people show up unexpectedly, they're not prepared for it. The United States and other countries are providing increased assistance to those countries, but it's still a real problem. People are losing weight inside Venezuela. The poverty rate is at 87%. People can't feed their families, and they are leaving the country and will continue to do so.
Sonia, it looked like you might want to jump in there as well and add your own thoughts to that. Let me ask you as well. I mean, do you believe that this is just going to be leading to more chaos, that the anti-migration sentiment will be growing, that it will be causing more tensions with neighboring countries?
Yeah, I think so, because the new economic measures imposed in Venezuela by President Maduro, they are going to cause that people are going to leave Venezuela day by day, and the numbers will increase, so the situation will be worse. I remember one of the first cases was in Panama and also in the Dominican Republic. Now it's in Peru and Ecuador. People are afraid, but actually there is a huge difference on what's happened today in Venezuela. There is no precedent on the influx of Venezuelans leaving the country in Latin America. But I would like to remind others that it was not long ago when in Venezuela was in a stable situation, and Venezuela was willing to receive all these foreigners.
Yeah, Venezuela was
region,
essentially the haven for the migrants from the other countries, correct?
Yeah, right. And actually, most of the Venezuelans, of course, there are some exceptions, but they are very skilled workers. So it's I don't see how the region is not showing solidarity right now with Venezuela.
Paul, what does it say to you that we're seeing, this increasing hostility towards these migrants?
It's worrying. It's very worrying. Venezuela, for anyone who's been in Venezuela and obviously has left the confines of an ambassador's residence or an embassy, who's not actually walked on the streets and talked to the people in Venezuela, will know that Venezuelans are very open-minded, very tolerant people. It's very rare to see expressions of violence and xenophobia here in Venezuela. As a foreigner living in Venezuela, I can testify to this. But now we're starting to see a lot of families here in Venezuela hearing from family members or friends who have emigrated out of the country and who have suffered from expressions of xenophobia. Quite recently, there was one on the border with Brazil. Only over the weekend, there were a series of arrests in Colombia as well for the same issue. And frequently we hear about these issues coming out of Peru. And these are greeted with shock here in Venezuela. These are greeted with disgust. The fact that people look on Venezuelans and treat them differently for being Venezuelans. And this is something new to Venezuelan society, and which has received massive rejection here in Venezuela.
Charles, from your vantage point, are we approaching a point by which borders would be closed to Venezuelans? Is that how bad it could get?
Look, every country is sovereign. They get to decide whether to open or close their borders and how many refugees to accept. Colombia has been extraordinarily welcoming to Venezuelans. One point I'd like to add is that the international community has offered to send humanitarian assistance to Venezuela with no strings attached. The European Union has, Canada, the U.S., the International Red Cross. We've offered to send it to U.S. has. We've offered to send it through the Red Cross or the Catholic Church so that there's no sense that other countries are somehow doing evil through this assistance. And the government of Venezuela has refused to accept it and says there is no crisis in Venezuela, no humanitarian crisis in Venezuela.
Sonia, if we're talking about the humanitarian crisis, could you just help our viewers to understand how dire things are for Venezuelans, how bad the situation is for them right now?
Well, imagine a country, once a very wealthy country, who now suffers from blackouts every day for a couple of hours or for more than 1 day or 2 days, no electricity, no water, no medicines, no food, not even cash, because Venezuelans, they do all their transactions with the credit cards, using ATMs or money transfers or so. Or some Venezuelans, they have to go to cross the border to Colombia in order to buy Venezuelan currency and go back to the country because there is a lack of cash too. So this is unbearable. And in addition to that, the insecurity. The lack of security in Venezuela. So it is horrible. The situation is horrible. What can people do there? There is no future, and that's why it's so dramatic, the situation. Even the hospitals, the clinic, they don't have the means in order to provide assistance to the sick people. So it is really very worrisome what's going on in Venezuela, especially because considering what Venezuela was in the past. It was a very wealthy country. Mm-hmm. And nobody can understand what's going on right now, not even the Venezuelans.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all so much. Thanks to all our guests, Paul Dobson, Sonia Schott, and Charles Shapiro. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.